Hello again. Welcome to the recorded lecture on Kwame Anthony Appiah's Washington Post opinion article titled, What Will Future Generations Condemn Us For? To start, why do we read this article? Kwame Anthony Appiah's thesis builds off of what we looked at with Schweikart and Young. Not issues that can be tackled with individual moral responsibility, but rather must be dealt with widespread change. And specifically, change that requires both moral thinking on the societal level and collective action. I wanted to read Appiah at the end of our semester because, in addition to it being a short and very clear article, it demonstrates the broad level thinking that it takes to think morally in our modern world in this 21st century. We need to remember that there are generations of people living after we're gone and living in the world we leave them. Another way to think about the title of this article is as the question, what do we owe future generations? Appiah's project is, at its core, about clarifying our collective moral thinking. To do this, he demonstrates the skill of abstracting from particular cases to understand some general truth or fact of the matter. He asks his reader to think abstractly and philosophically about how we might evaluate modern practices. In other words, to ask ourselves, what can we abstract from multiple modern moral issues to distill into criteria for moral evaluations? And so he is not focusing on any one issue, but providing a framework or model or a list of criteria for evaluating any issue. And this is helpful. This is the kind of concrete benefit that abstract thinking can lead to. In other words, Appiah invokes our moral imagination and philosophy to think longer term about moral issues, as opposed to thinking only presently or thinking only in terms of our powers for direct impact. Appiah identifies 3 signs that something is going morally wrong. They are 1, that moral arguments against the practice already exist. 2, that non-moral counter-arguments are made in response to those moral arguments. And 3, we observe a strategic ignorance on the part of those who are not critical of this practice and likely even benefit in some way from it. Appiah's specific principle of evaluation is interesting. It is not universal eternal goodness. It is not happiness or a good life. It is not some rational ideal from which we can derive moral rules. His principle of measuring moral goodness is how people who don't yet exist will look back on what we're doing today. Appiah uses the practice of slavery in the U.S. to illustrate the signs he identifies. Before the U.S. formally abolished slavery in 1865, Appiah argues that the signs that this practice would one day be morally judged were already present. So first, moral arguments against the practice already existed, and most people knew of them, right? Appiah says in the article, quote, the case against slavery didn't emerge in a blinding moment of moral clarity, for instance. It had been around for centuries, end quote. Second, the defenders of the practice offered non-moral counterarguments. The justification for the practice of slavery typically relied on ideas of tradition, human nature, or necessity. For example, people would say things along the lines of, we've always had slaves, or how could we grow cotton without them? And third, strategic ignorance. We see people, quote, avoiding truths that might force them to face the evils in which they are complicit, end quote. And Appiah goes on to explain, quote, like, those who ate the sugar or wore the cotton that the slaves grew simply didn't think about what made those goods possible. That's why abolitionists sought to draw attention toward the conditions of the Middle Passage through detailed illustrations of slave ships and horrifying stories of the suffering below decks, end quote. This last sign is particularly sharp in our age of information. It is no longer the case that we can simply say, I didn't know, no one told me. The information related to The information related issue is more about reliability of sources and determining criteria for trusting some sources over others. But notice this is still related to the issue of strategic ignorance. We do indeed have a burden upon us of figuring out how to know whether a company is using child labor, for example, or exploiting their workers in other ways, or dumping waste irresponsibly, or hiding sexual predators in their ranks, etc. But now we can no longer say we simply didn't know, because the answers are quite a bit closer to our fingertips than they previously were.